Deseto, the old plantation building, was ready to fall, but kept alive by some starry-eyed carpetbagger called Dr. Gray. Seeing how the staff couldn't even be bothered with answering the door, Detective Comby figured they would just head inside and grab Jeremy. He just needed to open the front door for Emily first, so she could talk to her uncle. Jeremy had gone missing. The housekeeper said the staff at Deseto was looking for him, and that Detective Comby and Emily should come back tomorrow. Hoping to wrap up this case before leaving, Comby hustled his way inside Jeremy's room, leaving the housekeeper flustered and running for Dr. Gray, the chief of Deseto. Having bought some time, this was the perfect opportunity to look for clues regarding Jeremy's disappearance. Detective Comby couldn't believe his eyes. The French Quarter scene before him was dark and sinister. The only sign of life he could see from Jeremy's balcony was the light coming from a lone corner store. Detective Comby hesitated to buy into the stranger's explanation, but it was all he had. Baptiste, this mountain of a man, seemed to suggest that this other world they had been pulled into was built from Jeremy's scattered memories. It sounded crazy to him, but Comby couldn't exactly deny the situation he found himself in. Baptiste believed Jeremy was able to move freely between worlds using a talisman he got from Miss Jackson, a voodoo witch doctor that made a good living from alleviating the rich from their ailments and their money. In hope to find Jeremy, or a way back to Deseto, Comby set out to investigate Miss Jackson's place. He recognized this place. It was Miss Jackson's seance room. The last time he was here, he had been trying to figure out the significance of wasps' nests and horsehair wrapped up in red silk. An image of a dead woman stabbed with hatpins flashed inside his mind. Comby shuddered. This was no time to dwell on the past. He needed to find out about the talisman and get back to Deseto. While Detective Comby was grateful to be back at Deseto, he was eager to test his hypothesis. After having suffered through that sinister world, dressed as the French Quarter, Jeremy's writing could be read much more literally. What if Jeremy used his talisman to actually visit those places he mentioned in the book? Comby felt certain that this was the answer. He wouldn't find Jeremy hiding inside Deseto. He would be in one of those other worlds. And to follow in his steps, Comby would have to investigate the old clock and the boiler and find out what part they played. McCarthy reminded Detective Comby of an old barfly he used to know. He detested him. There was no getting around it. McCarthy was going to have a hard time getting on his good side. The Simple Astrology cipher was a favorite among the artists who lived in the house 20 years ago. They easily turned into numbers when needed, but also acted as signatures for the members, as there were only 12 of them. Detective Comby had a hard time understanding what had happened. It did feel similar to when he was pulled into the French Quarter, but with less power and purpose. Did he cause this, or was it something else? If it wasn't for the collection of peculiar statues, the old astronomical clock would draw every eye in the room. To Conby, it wasn't the intricate clockwork that stood out, but the odd-looking plate on the inside. It reminded him of the ritual bench in Miss Jackson's seance room, where he had manipulated the talisman to open a door back to Derceto. He wanted to try to replicate the procedure, but found that the inner part of the plate was broken. He would have to find the missing pieces and put the plate back together. As his pride faded, Detective Conby was left with a feeling of unease. He had successfully managed to enter a whole new world. How could this be, and why did he accept this so readily? One thing was clear. There were no answers to be found by standing around questioning reality. Knowing only what he read in the commonplace book, Conby headed off to look for Jeremy in the hateful mound. It was a bust. The oil rig and the hateful mound led him nowhere closer to finding Jeremy. Conby was sure he had struck gold when he found Jeremy's bag, but it was just a trap set by Lottie, another of Derceto's orderlies. Things got out of hand real quick, but somehow Conby managed to find his way back to Derceto none the wiser. At least it was one item off his list. Now he had to figure out what to do with the boiler. Ruth seemed like a handful. Her talk about Jeremy and the Dark Man made it sound like she might know something of importance, but ultimately it felt like a dead end. Why did that girl look so familiar? Detective Conby just couldn't quite remember. His last few years were clouded by a drunken haze, a haze which now had turned almost opaque. Considering their shared past, Grace had every right to feel slighted, but it wasn't in her nature. She was amused. The medicine bottles had stains of rot on the labels, suggesting some greater shape. They just needed to be put in the right order. But for what purpose? Conby didn't know what to make of the grotesque vision of the dead clerk. Was he dead, or was it all fiction? The odious stench of a flooded cemetery caught him off guard. It was one of the many things that clued Detective Conby in on that this place wasn't the real thing. This was some nightmarish surrogate, patched together by Jeremy's tattered memories. This is why we bury above ground, he thought, and set off to find the chapel that Jeremy had mentioned. It was the chapel Jeremy had mentioned in his book. With a bit of luck, soon Conby would be able to catch up with the old man. He just needed to find a way inside the chapel. Jeremy didn't want to be saved. He felt the need to honor some deal he made with an entity called the Dark Man. Conby wanted to think it was ridiculous, but a brief encounter with that unbearable gloom had shaken him to his core. Conby had seen a lot of bad things in his life, but he had never before been this terrified. After gathering his thoughts, Conby figured he would need to chase after Jeremy in the only place left he could think of. He needed to go to Tarawea. Hirosi's body looked unharmed. Conby couldn't figure out how she died, or why this wasn't a bigger upset to the people at Derceto. Jeremy had found a way to enter Tarawea, but he wasn't allowed to go. He knew deep down that it was impossible for him to cross that threshold. Instead, he hoped that Perosi would go in his place and burn his library to the ground so he could start again. But she never got the chance. Perosi had her own problems, her own demons, and she died suddenly one day without warning. Holding the telescope lens in his hands, Detective Conby suspected what it was. At least a part of the key to that paradise Jeremy so desperately wanted to see. Curious what he would find, he felt eager to put the lens to use. Another world seeping into Derceto. Was this a taste of that mysterious Terrawea? Conby felt confused by the pleasant nature of Terrawea. It was somehow uncomfortable to him. Juan, the sweater-wearing Buddha, wasn't helping either. According to Conby, people just weren't meant to be this nice and genuine. Best to hurry off to the library, he thought, and see if he could find information about Jeremy's relationship with the Dog Man. Somehow Conby was back in New Orleans, close to the docks. He could smell the pungent aroma of the Mississippi River. In front of him was the Prext Shipping Company. According to the book in the library, he should find the address to where Jeremy first met the Dog Man inside. The address of the event where Jeremy first met the Dog Man surprised Conby. The infamous Gallatin Street didn't exist any longer, and he wondered if he would be able to find the right building. Was it still standing? Did it matter? Maybe this world was not just another place, but another time as well. Conby found himself in a vast and dark desert. He had suddenly had his share of strange happenings this evening, but the thought of walking through the land of Tutankhamun was definitely challenging his last bastion of disbelief. The Dog Man's temple was buried beneath the sand, a cursed and dark place. Every step felt ill-considered. Conby needed to find the contract that Jeremy signed with the Dog Man and get the hell out of here before he went completely mad. Conby never thought he'd be so happy to be back at Derceto. It felt like he had crawled through a long, dark tunnel of misery and regret. Now that he was back, Conby could look into the steps mentioned in the contract, but there was one thing that gnawed on him. What exactly did this have to do with Dr. Gray? The two orderlies still hadn't found Jeremy. Conby figured this was good news. Emily had reminded him about some strange deaths at Derceto, and Conby wasn't sure who he could trust. McCarthy was a deadbeat. His mere presence annoyed Conby. It was like watching the worst version of himself mock him by simply being worthless. While Conby enjoyed watching the child outplay the drunkard, there was something terrifyingly familiar about Grace. It was taunting him, like he was supposed to remember, but couldn't. Dr. Gray was somehow mixed up in this business with the Dog Man, Detective Conby decided. He had to be. Either Dr. Gray was using the idea of the Dog Man to manipulate and torture Jeremy, or the Dog Man was an actual powerful being possessing Jeremy. And in that case, Dr. Gray was simply a stooge. Maybe both could be true at once. Conby felt his mind racing in all directions, No matter what, he had to find a way to break the pact. That was what Jeremy said was needed. It didn't even matter what was true or not. If Jeremy wouldn't leave Derceto before the contract was broken, then Conley had to make it happen. He just wished the steps on the contract made a little more sense. The steamboat was a hideaway that Jeremy had built over the last few days. Having seen his memories extracted and expanded into physical realms by the Dog Man, his unconscious mind had decided to take the chance that Jeremy could manifest a world in secret. A world that wasn't sanctioned by the Dog Man. Deploying his own self-deceit as a gambit against his dog master. The Dog Man had forced Conley to face his memories of Grace and her father, how he ran him off the bridge at Pearl River and carried on to steal his child as he was drowning. He then handed Grace off to her mother because that was the job, and you don't question the job. You take the money and get drunk. As Conley slowly accepted his trouble, he started to wonder why it was his and not Jeremy's. It wasn't clear to Detective Conley that he had actually accomplished anything, but he had the distinct feeling that he was making progress. The steamboat must have been what the self-deceit was referring to, and clearly the business with Grace was psychological trauma. Out of the 3 steps on the Dog Man's contract, only one thing seemed to remain: tempomanic behavior. Conley was getting sick of guessing. It was time to pay Dr. Gray a visit in his apartment. The empty room always felt familiar. It had a mild fragrance of crushed leaves and wet sand that somehow convinced visitors that they belonged. It wasn't real, of course, but it was more real than many other things you could find. He was back in the French Quarter, his office to be exact. A place Jeremy had certainly never seen. It could only mean that the Dog Man had reached inside Edward's mind and conjured this place for him to suffer. Conley vaguely remembered the case of the missing child. She was kidnapped by her estranged father. There was some connection to a gallerist named Thornhill, a painting sold to pay for a getaway. The kidnapper had sold a painting to Thornhill, the collector, to pay for a car and enough gas to get out of Louisiana. Detective Conley was suddenly reminded of shaking him down to find out where the kidnapper was hiding. St. George's Hotel by the park. Detective Conley didn't recognize the bridge across Pearl River. It was firmly obfuscated by trauma. Events that had left Conley scarred for life. Dr. Gray had been putting Jeremy through some thorough medical investigation. He was trying to break through Jeremy's stories and get to some truth, just like Conley was. Could Dr. Gray have been trying to break the contract as well? Conley entered some new, lucky dreamland of Jeremy's. A long-abandoned steamboat aground in the bayou. Jeremy was calling out for help, but Conley couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from. For a moment, Conley wondered if the boat itself was Jeremy, or if he was below it somehow. It didn't matter right now. Jeremy was clear on one thing. He wanted Conley to get the steamboat running and out of the mud. Conby had run their car off the bridge. He pulled Grace out of the sinking car, but left her father to drown. He could have saved him. There was time. He just chose not to. Instead, he took Grace back to New Orleans and collected his paycheck. Detective Conby felt removed from himself. Like driving drunk, he carefully tried to navigate his environment. What the hell was going on? Was he finally losing his mind? At least Emily was here to call the police if he went off the deep end. Detective Conby wanted nothing more than to make sense of it all, but clearly that was not in the cards right now. Detective Conby was worried Emily could tell, that she could see the madness written on his face. But what if he was the only one seeing the truth? Could that still be the case? If only he could find evidence that would make her understand that he had seen beyond the veil, or at least something that would show her he was worth the money she was paying him. Disheartened by his failure to make Emily understand what he was doing, Detective Conby actually felt better seeing the frozen hell before him. There was a finality to it. Its clear symbolic opposite to the dark man's desert made him realize this was the end. Soon it would all be over. Everything was back to normal. Did any of it really happen? What had Conby actually been doing all night? Case closed. Detective Conby had found Jeremy and brought him back to Derceto. He worried that Emily wouldn't be all that happy with his performance, considering Jeremy's impromptu brain surgery. Maybe she would refuse to pay him in full. It was the kind of thought that would normally infuriate Conby, but right now he just felt happy to be back. No matter if he would be seeing the $150 or not, he couldn't wait to rendezvous with Emily and go back to New Orleans. Detective Conby returned just as the festivities were about to begin. Emily was grateful that she didn't have to sit through whatever ceremony the people at Derceto had fashioned. Instead, they excused themselves and made their way to the front side of the house. With a tremendous sense of relief, Emily climbed into the car. She watched Conby ready the back seat for Jeremy in the rearview mirror. What a long night, she thought. Thank God it's all over.